everyone. Thank you so much for showing up. Uh, I know there's this dramatic scenario going around here with the section 144, the pollution and all that, but thank you so much for being here. Um, so we're really happy that this turned out really nice. So we started off at a very small scale with just few people and a very small workshop. We had it at a different venue, but we had such overwhelming response that we actually had to change the venue, and we're here now. So this is this makes us very happy. So the main aim of this workshop was to bring together people from policy, from industry, and from academia working on behavioral economics, the people who share this common passion to work out a way to bring about a betterment of the Indian community using behavioral economics. So we have 3 different panels. We have one on introduction, which is basically people from academia. And then we'll have a panel discussion with people from policy. And then we'll have one from the industry, people who work with industries and use behavioral economic insights there. As you know, there was this really long waiting list for this workshop. And so we set up a live streaming as well. And that is the link for the live stream. So in case some of your friends want to watch, then please share this link with them. Okay, and I'd like to introduce the organizers now. And it'll be nice if you guys just wave at the people when I introduce you guys. So that's Pankti. And Pankti works in the UK. She's a behavioral scientist. And she did her master's in the UK as well. And this is Divyani. And Divyani also studied behavioral economics in the UK. And that's me. And I'm currently doing my PhD in University of Zurich. I'm also teaching staff there, so I teach there. And that's Jafar. And Jafar works for Final Mile, which we'll hear about a lot today. Right, so if you see one thing in common there, all 4 of us studied behavioral economics in the UK, which is nice because it's something that brings us together. But it's so sad that we don't have it in India when there is so many people who actually want to study it here. And India is an amazing place to study behavioral economics. We have so much social norms. We have such rich culture. And behavioral economics would be super applicable here in India. And in case there's someone from academia watching this, some institution, then please introduce behavioral economic courses in your universities and colleges because, good. Yes, but everybody, please do introduce. So do not worry about people taking it up because people will. Everyone is super passionate about it. This is an amazing and super interesting subject. And I know so many people from computer science, from civil engineering, and so many other subjects who are reading so many books on behavioral economics. So everyone is interested in it. And I think it's very important that we introduce it in India in formal education. And obviously for the ones who are interested in the subject right here who want to learn more, obviously you can learn a lot online, but having formal education would be really nice. So that's something I wanted to say here. Jafar and I, we both studied at the University of Nottingham, and this is the Indian Behavioral Economics Network that we started after a long discussion of how sad it is that we don't have behavioral economics in India. So when we came back from our masters, we wanted to do something. We wanted to promote the subject here, and yes, obviously there wasn't much already. So we just started off very small as a very small Facebook group and a LinkedIn group where we shared stuff, and we started meeting up in different locations in Chennai and Bangalore. And Divyani also helped us organize it in Delhi. She also was separately interested. She'll tell her story next. It's quite interesting. I heard it yesterday. So we started off very small, and now we have spread out a lot, and now we're organizing this workshop, and we plan to do this every year. So we look forward to your association with us in the future as well. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is this book that you all probably got. So it's called Synergia. So this is the definition of Synergia that I took stole from somewhere. So it's called cooperation of two or more entities to produce a combined effect of sorry, I wrote it wrong here, but yeah. To produce a combined effect which is greater than the sum of the separate effects. So basically, we wanted to use this name because it's all of us coming together, and obviously the combined effect is going to be so much more. And it's also funny because the subject is also a combination of so many different subjects, and it is providing amazing insights. Now I would like to pass on the mic to Divyani, and she would tell you the story of New Delhi Behavioural Network, and then we'll move on to the panels. Thank you.
Thank you, Janofi. I won't take too much of your time. We've already started late. But so my story is not very interesting, but a little short. I got interested in the subject of behavioral economics because I was pushed by one of my professors to attend a workshop that was outside of my mandated syllabus, which ended up in me going and doing my master's in the University of Warwick. Which was an excellent experience. I think we had some of the people who were working already. I think what we take back from our degrees in the UK is that a lot of our professors are already working in industry and then coming back and teaching us in the classroom, which makes the knowledge even more tacit for us and a lot more just holistic, and so it's just something we brought back, and we all just came back and wanted to start something. I came back to India in 2015, and I wrote out to 20 people asking to start a network, and one person responded, and that person is in the room today, but it's just to show that in the 2 years that I sent out that email again to about 25 people and got back 40 responses, is how that kind of community grew in that 2-year period. And this is just talking about Delhi. I'm not talking about the other cities that we kind of reached out to. And it was wonderful to see the India Behavioural Network start up at the same time, because we had a nationwide community growing and people coming up to do the same thing. I think the one thing that we learned from these communities back in the UK, we have the London Behavioural Network and the Amsterdam Behavioural Network, and we wanted to bring something similar because they've all understood the importance of applying behavioral science and behavioral economics in our real world problems, in the things that we face on a daily basis. And that's just the kind of learning community that we wanted to build and kind of nurture here. And we hope that this is one giant leap forward, which was completely unexpected in doing this for us. So the one thing that we've noticed about our culture is that, and this is the learning that we've tried to put out in our book also, is that the culture and community in India is very different from what we see everywhere else. So bringing people together in this community and expecting them to respond in the same way that communities abroad do will not work, which is how we've evolved, and we've modeled this community to learn and apply differently. And we're hoping that the panel discussions today bring to light some of the issues and some of the successes that the companies and institutions have faced in their experience in India. So it's been a little over a year for all of us at India Behavioural Economics Network and for New Delhi Behavioural Economics Network. And we just wanted to get together and celebrate with this small community, and we could not have imagined the kind of support and encouragement we've received from our sponsors, from all our panelists who agreed and who've made it through, like Janofi said, some very hard times in Delhi. And we couldn't be more thankful. Thank you so much, and I hope you all enjoy what we have in store for you today. I would now like to invite Anirudh, who is a research author at the Department of Economics at Monk Prayogshala. He will be moderating the first session, which is Academic Policy and Implementation Perspectives in Behavioral Economics. And he will introduce our next speakers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anirudh, and I'm going to be moderating the first session, which is the introductory session. And we're just going to discuss some basic concepts and some motivations that behavioral economics has. And I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Anurag Vaish, who's the founding partner at Final Mile Consulting, who's also the industry partner for this event. We have Sujoy Chakravarti, who is Professor Sujoy Chakravarti, who is from the Center for economic studies and planning at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And we have Nate Peterson, who is the Vice President of Partnerships at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics in Nairobi. So if you could all join me on stage, we'll get started. Thank you. Uh, okay, so in terms of ground rules, we have 15 minutes per speaker, so feel free to present how much ever you can in that time. I believe there's a timekeeper somewhere in the audience, so keep your eyes out. They will show you a time when you have to stop speaking, so don't make me interrupt you. Yeah, so we're going to get started with Anurag, and yeah, you have 15 minutes, so take a seat.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so can you hear me? So I'm Anurag, and I'm happy to be here today. A year back, I got to know about IBM. Is it working? Not working? It's working. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So I was saying that a year back, I kind of got to know about IBM when they invited me to kind of say something at one of their meetups at Dulali, which is a upmarket beer place. And we had lots of good beer in the room that day. And we also had the founder of, or the owner of Dulali sitting there, sponsoring some of our beers, right? And it's been a year now, and we have a different room. What we don't have is the beer, obviously. But fortunately, we have people today. That day we didn't have much people, right? There's like some 4 or 5 of us kind of sitting and incessantly talking about behavioral sciences. So it's been a great journey, and congratulations to the IBM team for kind of taking the leap. And I can already see how next year is going to be much bigger, right? There's no question about that. And the more we talk, the better the science becomes, right? I mean, the only way this science can grow is through discussion. There is no other route, right? There is not enough academicians who can kind of come and say they practice this science over years, like advertising and research and everything else, right? So, good start to what we have right now. I think it's fantastic to be here. I want to talk a little bit about our journey, as in how did we get introduced to this science, right? I mean, I was obviously fascinated by the idea of rationality when it kind of came into being. In 2007 when we started, that was one of the talk of the town, and for some time it was interesting. I mean, then you start questioning yourself and say, am I the same stupid who is reading this irrationality, right? But thankfully, quickly you realize that it's not as much irrationality as it is intuitive wisdom, right? I mean, everything seems intuitively right. You don't have to explain, you don't have to kind of push hard for people to understand how a system 1, system 2 can coexist, even though they don't, as in they're not like separate things, they're just one thing, but people understand it, right? But then, once you kind of start to look at even deeper science around what, people like Damasios and Kahnemans and Eric Kandels of the world have to say, you realize that this is not intuitive wisdom, this is intuitive science, right? There's consistency to it, there's a pattern to it, it's systematic in nature, and you can take it to the industry. You can take it to the industry and say, there's not just some advisory panel sitting over there saying, I've read a few books and I can tell you what you can do to solve a problem, right? I can put a scientific process to it, right? And that was great because, whoever we spoke to empathized. They said, I understand what you're saying, right? But now let's do something about it, right? And I think we've seen a lot of development in this science, but to me, the single largest thing that happened in this science in the last 20 years is the idea of nudge. Right? Because what it did was it suddenly put a direction to all this learning, right? You can swim in this ocean of science and keep learning how to explain these complex behaviors and the irrationalities and stupidities of human behavior. But I think what Taylor did was he kind of put that thing out there saying that, do all of this to create something as subtle, as embedded in the environments and create impact, right? And don't think complex, don't think like, big, transformational solutions. No, kind of create something as simple as a nudge. And that's, I think, kind of it became the talk of the town, which is great, and everybody started talking about it. It's also a double-edged sword if you work in industry a lot, because people are now saying, oh, if it's that simple, it should also happen that simply, right? You can't be saying, I need 6 months to figure a nudge. Like, go get a nudge for me, right? Um, and I think we enjoyed that process, but when we started, because there was nobody to tell us what is right and what is wrong, Taylor did tell us what is right, what is wrong. But we kind of said, let's kind of build on it, right? And I think that's what all of you are doing, all the people that I'm meeting today. I think we are all building engines on this science, an engine that we can own and kind of convert something that's theoretical into a practice, right? And I think we had our opportunity to build that engine as well. And I don't know how much time has passed, so I can kind of make sure that I cover the topics that I need to cover. Uh, but that's one of the engines, those yellow lines is a kind of engine. I mean, it looks like a solution, but to kind of give you a very quick version of this story, and I think some of you heard about it, but about 10 people get killed in Bombay every day while trespassing tracks, right? And there are enough theories and enough explanations on why this happens. Right? Most of it is in the area of stupidity again, saying people are adventurous, careless, talking on the phone, suicidal, and so on and so forth. But when we started investigating the issue, we did recognize one of the theoretical constructs of the brain, that the human brain has not evolved enough to understand speed of large, fast-moving objects, right? So a train, a plane, a ship will always look slower than what it does, and therefore it was creating some kind of a judgment error on the tracks, leading to people kind of falling in the path of death. Right? And I think that's not interesting. That's not something we discovered. That existed in the theories somewhere hidden away, right? What we really discovered was, so what do you do with it? What do we do with such an insight when you have a fundamental insight on the human brain and you have no way of changing it? You can't operate on this brain and say, from tomorrow onwards, you will estimate speed correctly. In another 100,000 years, probably that can be get sorted. But in the meanwhile, we said we need to design a solution that kind of changes this rather tragic stat around death. And the obvious options were to do more awareness campaigns, right? Saying, let's kind of tell the people how fast trains are and then be careful. But then the fact of the matter is that I never saw anybody calculating speeds of a train while just passing tracks, right? It's just such an unconscious process that you yourself are not aware of what you're doing. Right? And so we kind of created this design called the yellow lines, which is something that we've been hanging on for the last 12 years, telling everybody who we can find the story. But the idea was to kind of change the reference speed. So I can't estimate speed of large, fast-moving objects, but I can see how fast these lines disappear under the train. Right? And we never told anybody what's the purpose of these lines. The people who are trespassing never knew that these lines are meant for them. But our brains are curious beings, in the sense that one of the one of the interesting facts about our brain is that we have never learned to ignore any information in our environment. It's just that it's not consciously available to you, but non-consciously you process every piece of information and then kind of make sense of it and figure out if it's useful for you or not. Now some of that happened, some dissonance happened probably, some estimation correction happened, but whatever happened, the death rates kind of climbed down dramatically. Right? In fact, just last month we concluded the latest round of implementation in this area between Thane and Mumra in Bombay, a 5-kilometer stretch, which used to see an average about 90 deaths every 6 months, and the latest stat is about 44, right? So it kind of brought it down by about 50–60%, right? So, and that's not the engine. That's just a version of nudge, if you might say, something that we call non-conscious design, where you're not dependent on people's awareness and motivation for their behaviors to be influenced. Right? I mean, nobody knows these lines are for them, but they're saving themselves. Right? But the engine we built was really to say, how do we consistently deliver these kind of solutions? Right? And that's been the chase over the last 12 years, saying, do we have a process to this science? Right? Is there an effective process that goes across businesses and impact organizations and government, right, which is efficient in terms of how much time it takes. It cannot be a 10, 12-year process. It needs to be finished in a finite 10, 12, 15, 20, 30 weeks, depending on projects. It needs to have stages, and everything in that stages, right, whether you're talking about research or strategy or design, is totally influenced by behavioral sciences, right? So you cannot say that I understand that the human brain makes decisions non-consciously, and yet I'll go and conduct interviews with people, right? If people are not aware of why they're doing what they're doing, so all the best, go keep asking, right? So start with changing the research process, start with changing the sense-making process and say, you know what, it's not logic that people bring to the table when making decisions. So if it's not logic, what is it? Right? Bring those into sense-making and then kind of constantly aim for that kind of design. Not that you'll get it every time, right? Maybe 90% of times you won't get it. But keep chasing it so you kind of keep getting closer to it, right? So that's been, I think, our contribution, and we've seen it work across markets, across continents, and I think India is, in many ways, the best playground for this science, right? It is just amazing because we are dealing with so of resources. So we need those kind of solutions, right? It's very easy to say, create these over bridges and tunnels and so on and so forth, but all the best again, right? It's much easier to put a $50 paint on those tracks and save lives than kind of keep waiting for those infrastructural changes, right? But as somebody referred, there are a lot of frustrations as well. After 12 years, it doesn't look like we are very frustrated, but one of the frustrations is obviously academic in nature because there is nobody teaching behavioral science in India in any systematic way. I know some of our people in our office kind of go and teach in different universities, but that's not the kind of teaching you need if you want to really kind of convert this into a practice, right? Uh, there are some colleges. I am Ahmedabad. I know somebody was teaching something. Bangalore was teaching something. Thankfully, we have got some really nice design houses now in India, right? Shristi's and the kind of things we are seeing. Those design houses have not adopted behavioral sciences in any significant way, right? Just the way how the Stanford School of Design now kind of integrates behavioral sciences is not what's happening in India, right? We tried to do our bit. We kind of promoted internship in our system, so literally anybody could walk in and do an internship, right? A 12th standard kid could walk in, do internship, first year, second year, third year, planning to go and study in UK, please come, there's no problem. Um, we have created a library where people can study. We are fairly free all the time, so we're happy to kind of put our advice on the table. So that's been our effort, but I think it's nowhere near enough. But what we all can do is create this internship environment where we're open to have people come to our offices and see how we work, what we do, how is the science being synthesized. So that's one thing that we should definitely kind of promote. The other big frustration is obviously, I was telling somebody just now that, there are things that are successful but not as pleasurable. And then there are things which are very pleasurable but not successful, right? So when I do work with, delinquency management, for instance, in the banking industry, very successful, very, very nice, right? I can be very happy about it. But what I really want to be happy about is how a financial inclusion project gets implemented. But that doesn't get implemented. As I wish Alok Kumar was in the room today when we are speaking, but it's a problem, that when we do work in TVs and road safeties and inclusion and, social vulnerability, child nutrition, mother nutrition programs, one, they have such large gestation periods, but then the chance of implementation itself is pretty low, right? So it kind of ends up being a fancy research project rather than a design project, right? So yeah, I can go on and on. I'm fairly obsessed with myself, and I can talk about the science all day. But I think it's a great start. We have a conversation building. The more we converse, the better it will get, right? And I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody say some things about the science today and just not speaking because I've been told 15 minutes and get out. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to the day.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to come to Sujoy because there were some pointed questions in there. So I think it would be good to get Sujoy's thoughts on what he's going to speak about as well. We do have a panel discussion that's coming in after all the speakers finish. So, if you have questions, then hold on to them. We'll definitely take them later. So, okay, yeah. So.
Okay, so I will attempt in a few minutes to try to bring in some academic perspectives into this. So, and maybe unbeknownst to some of you, I have been doing this, teaching behavioral economics and experimental economics for about maybe 11 to 12 years now at JNU, and before that, when I was at IIM, I was known as the professor who gambled with students and money and lotteries and stuff like that. So that was my reputation. Like, आप जुआ खेलते हैं student के साथ, ज़्यादा grades भी देते हैं आपको. So they thought it was some nexus actually between me and the MBA students because I was paying them money and they were playing these games and they were very happy with me. And when I got a good teaching eval, it would be like, oh yeah, those experiments, that money. So that's how I started in India. I got interested in this field because I was starting out as a theorist, actually, at the economics department at Purdue University, which is in the US. And after about 2 years of it, I was a little bored, and I was kind of looking for ways out. And then I did a psychology class, PhD level psychology class in Purdue. And that really changed my perspective on research, on behavior, on economic behavior. We had to do bizarre stuff like throw darts at world figures, and they would evaluate how much where the dart hit. So that research is way more adventurous than we can muster in economics, I think, at least. So that's how I got interested. I was, of course, told by the mainstream field that it's all mumbo jumbo. Don't get into this psych stuff. Just do some economics things. Like how do incentives work and do they move us? And if we give X amount of incentive, do people behave in Y ways? And to some extent, I mean, I'm not throwing that textbook away. It is true that human beings do respond to incentives. But there's a big sort of ways between responding to incentives and the representative agent models that we use largely in economic theory, which I'm well trained in, given that I have a background in game and decision theory. And so I feel what it does, and I mean, I'm giving you an academic perspective because I think you'll get the other perspectives from many people in this room. I think what we are trying to do here, what Taylor, Ariely, Lowenstein, all these guys are trying to do, is they are trying to kind of enrich the model of the consumer, of the producer, of an economic agent to include certain other points, which were missing. I mean, you have economic theories which just tell you, you have a theory by Hotelling which tells you, ice cream vendors separate equidistant on the Jersey Shore. And that's like Nash equilibrium and stuff. But the thing is, if you actually try to measure behavior of ice cream vendors, you're not going to get that behavior because there's a whole lot of other contextual factors that determine it. So, it's not to say that Hotelling didn't make a great contribution. He did. And I mean, I'm not going to come up here and say, oh, it's all nonsense, and we've figured it out with behavioral science, and everything before that isn't rubbish, That's the kind of, I think that's really backwards thinking, and we have some of that in India, I think. The next big thing comes along, and we're like, oh, everything is nonsense before that. So we need to kind of get a perspective, a sense of perspective. I'm not in love with economic theory. I think it's way clunky and way behind. I'm talking about conventional economic theory, of course, where a lot of us are doing interesting stuff, and a lot of my theory colleagues are really doing interesting stuff in the US and the UK. So I'm going to quickly, because I don't have much time, take you through a few of the slides. I made 16 slides thinking 15 minutes, 16 slides, but I'm not going to get through those slides. So I'm just going to quickly go. I just told you what mainstream theory does. This may make a little sense, actually, if you can see it. This is from Vernon Smith, who's a Nobel laureate, his paper in American Economic Review. I just added a box. So quickly, economic behavior before behavioral economics was those top 3 boxes, okay? Environment, choice, behavior to outcomes. Oh, I'm so sorry. So it's, I can talk loudly because I can't, I have to like crane my head like that. So economic behavior was felt up to about 1960 to be agent costs, agent beliefs, and behavior, all of that. You have agents have all kinds of proclivities, like their utility functions, and and then they just do some behavior based on those starting conditions, and outcomes these allocations, prices, etc. But I mean, somewhere we found out in the post-60s that institutions mattered in and of themselves. Like it was institutions, of course, affect these environmental values, but they are also determining in entities in the market. What we found out after the 80s was that actually culture and demographics matter too. And in the sense that context is extremely important to studying behavior. And the same financial incentive given in Timbuktu doesn't do the same as something given in New Delhi. So this is something to be really understood. This is something that first generation economists, including my original training, we didn't believe in. Because we thought, hey, we can just get that model, apply it, and Anirudh will agree with me, he's trained in similar ways. Okay, so moving on, actual behavior is quite different. We have all these artifactual games that we do in the experimental behavioral economics literature, and I have some work there if you guys are interested in reading it. It's on my Scholar page. And actual situations of cooperation, reciprocity, human beings, of course, are maximizers. So I wouldn't say we're just, some hippie type, who doesn't want to maximize anything. No, we do want to maximize, but we are also touched by, things like norms, for example. I'm sorry, I'm jumping because I can't finish the slides. Individuals are driven by cultural moral norms that make them choose optimizing actions even though these maximize material wealth. So this is kind of going against a lot of the completely mainstream wisdom in economics. This form of cooperation is higher and higher with in-group members. So this is the big addition of this whole canon from psychology that has come in, telling us that, yeah, we care. We compete, we care, but we care more if you're in the in-group. And the in-groups are really funny things. I mean, they come from an evolutionary perspective. Humans form in-groups almost instinctively. Like today, I don't know any of you, and we're in the behavioral network. Tomorrow, I will be like, okay, I know these guys. They're in the behavioral network, and I may give them preferential treatment, even though I don't personally know you, but that label is attached. So Henrik Tajfel did really good experiments with what he called minimal group paradigm, which is just getting people in the room, labeling them A and B, and seeing them display deep in-group favoritism and out-group almost hostility. So regarding cognitive biases, I'm dividing it like Taylor, norms, cognitive biases, and self-control issues, though I think the last 2 points can be clubbed together. Certain events or processes are perceived and processed in certain ways in our brain, which may work superbly in some contexts and fail in others. I've put the references. You can later on read these. These will give you a really good perspective on something. We are also very susceptible to priming, framing, and other processes that attempt to change our behavioral reference points. So our behaviors are rarely absolute, as told in economic theory. Our income doesn't necessarily generate behavior, but it's our income in conjunction with other people's income. That is what is driving it a lot. And this is the big, if you want one great killer app that Kahneman Tversky introduced in 1979 was this idea of reference points. And he really said that, you think it's a gain, but your brain is thinking it's a loss. This kind of stuff. And so I would like to refer you to their paper in econometrica, for those of you who have the stomach for that stuff. But you know, so finally I come to self-control issues. These were deemed by Thaler to be in and of themselves really important because they pertain to saving, time behavior, time value of money, personal finance, all of these things. And you know, we are strongly presently biased that we find, unlike stronger than what we thought before. But it's a weird hyperbolic type of bias that is when things go in the future, then we don't care so much about, we are not so impatient. We almost reverse our preferences when the rewards are much in the future. We use rigid mental accounts, like if I want to buy a car, I'm saving money, and my stereo blows, I'm going to not spend the money because it's for the car. You know, these kinds of weird self-imposed things we do to ourselves are prone to strong behavioral inertia. Like unless somebody puts in a little default, we just invest 5% for the rest of our life. That kind of thing. Unless somebody, I mean, we do that in India already. When people tell you, "Aap sirf sign kar dijiye, idhar naam dal dijiye aur picture idhar kar dijiye," that's what they're doing. They're giving you a default. By the way, if you think that it's only Madrian and Shia's paper in Quarterly Journal of Economics, that's not true. It's happening all the time. You go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, you know, people are changing your defaults. But are you doing it systematically? No. The answer is probably not. And they're doing it to maximize some other entity's welfare. Like the touts want like the most money, so they'll click something, or they'll check something. You know, it's like that. Finally, endowment effects. We love things we own, and it's strange. This affects saving behavior, selling of stocks, all of that. Okay, how am I doing for time? Anybody? Okay. 5 minutes to go? All right. So I'm going to quickly go after showing you the school. So we have this kind of situation in our brain where we have lots of information, but we organize it in a certain way to throw some stuff out and put some stuff in. It often works. It works really well, actually. So I'm not going to say, oh, my God, like, you know, look at these morons, pink morons on stage, you know, the picture. But, okay. And these are the kinds of things your mind does, actually. So that's called the Muller-Lyer illusions. Some of you must have seen it. They're exactly the same, the black lights. Even better is this one. This is amazing, actually. I mean, even I'm telling you that the one on the left is bigger than the one on the right, the middle circle, but your eyes are playing tricks. You're still not able to comprehend it. Now, you look at the power of what our brains are hardwired to do. So you can't tell this. Okay, so finally, I'm going to go over all this and say, what does this mean for policy? Because this is what I'm really interested in. I'm less interested a priori in using nudges and such other things to sell all kinds of cool stuff to people, but I'm more interested in maybe selling them stuff that can actually give them a better life. And development policy, this is why these guys, including a student of my own economics department at JNU, Abhijit Banerjee, won the Nobel Prize this time, is to show exactly that. Simple, often supply-side material incentives do not always lead to adoption, use, and best practices. Demand-side incentives like nudges, boosts are largely effective, usually in conjunction with hard economic incentives. Like in and of themselves, they're quite flaky and contextual, I believe, though their effects are very contextual. Environmental policy, people's brains aren't built to take quick lifestyle-altering decisions when the benefit per capita, that is their benefit to them, from these changes do not manifest in the same time frame or ever in their lifetimes. Try education policies that really try to inform individuals of the collective need to alter our habits for the preservation of our speeches. So nudges, boosts, I don't know, getting people together, talking about these issues rather than, nobody writes about climate issues, though we have some really scary things coming up and which will affect all of us in this room, especially the younger people. And finally, societal governance, individuals show enormous, what we call parochial altruism, which is selective empathy towards in-group members. This leads to polarization of communities, societies along the lines of caste, religion, race, economic status that affect institutions, law and order, and economic output. Education policy needs to be hardwired to build empathy, make people aware of these biases so they can consciously attempt to revise them. So this you need what we call going nudge plus, which is called a boost. where you're actually giving programs. So all of the stuff that we do under community mobilization, Sanchalaks coming to people's houses and showing people how to use XYZ technology, all of these are also what Sunstein called long-range nudges or boosts, or what Gigerenzer and his group at Max Planck called boosts, which are bigger than nudges. The nudges work with, some say the stupidity of humans, like, people are stupid, so give them stupid stuff. Well, boosts actually try to alter their behavior in the longer term. And finally, with financial markets, just regulate and educate. They're a complete mess. The retail investors have all kinds of these earlier biases, which makes them panic sell, panic buy, do all kinds of stuff. The corporate entities themselves peddling this stuff also understands these biases and attempts to kind of trick them. So just regulate on one side and educate on the other side so that we don't have collapses and crashes. Okay, I think I'm kind of done unless, okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sajay. So in true academic style, Sajay presented more text than probably the entire day combined. So, but
I was going to present more, actually. I took pity on you guys.
yeah, no, it was nice to see some images in there. Okay, so we're going to have Nate up next. And yeah, you have 15 minutes. So take it away.
Do I have some slides? Nice. So I can be heard, yeah. So I'll be talking kind of from a more practical application side of things. So my personal background is that I did the PhD program at Carnegie Mellon in behavioral decision research, which is where George Lowenstein is. And while doing it, I had an advisor who passed away, and I got into consulting. And so I left my PhD program and became a consultant, and then finished my PhD program while I was a consultant, which is a terrible, terrible idea for any of you considering it. But anyway, it gave me a lot of idea of how to take the academic literature and extend it and design interventions and help clients understand our process, which is one of the reasons that I'm now the VP of Partnerships at Busara, where instead of designing experiments, which these fine people over here do, including Nick, I actually mostly sell this process and help people understand why behavioral science has these components and how they should be understood. So a quick intro of Busara, maybe, we'll see. I have to turn the clicker on again. I didn't do it.
Are you not being able to change it?
I don't think so. Oh, there I have. It is. Are you changing it for me? Oh, thank you. All right. You taking responsibility. Okay, so anyway, Busara, we're headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, and we say we apply and advance and apply behavioral science in the global south. So we have our headquarters in Nairobi. We have a pretty big office now in Lagos, Nigeria, and we have an emerging, growing office here in Delhi. Click. So Busara originally started as a kind of a Princeton-affiliated academic research lab, which was attempting to solve this weird problem. Click again, which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies are where behavioral science research has come from, which is hugely problematic, not just because they're not representative of the people that we want to help, but they're actually not representative of humanity if you look at those types of representations. So we have this nice map, which is the world scale to population. There's some big countries you'll be familiar with. And then this is the version of it with published research, especially in the behavioral sciences. I use this a lot in Africa because it essentially evaporates. But you see this massive overrepresentation of it's okay, of countries that it doesn't correspond to population. So Busara really exists, and we started this academic quality research lab in Nairobi to begin closing this gap. There's still a very, very long way to go, but that's sort of our mandate. So right now, I'm going to talk about 4 interrelated things. How do we identify cognitive biases? Like, we know they exist. We saw some lovely slides that these heuristics and biases in decision-making exist in the world. But we need to validate them for a particular problem we're trying to solve for a client. We need to design interventions to overcome them or help facilitate whatever optimal decision behavior we're looking to. And then we need to test those and make sure that we're not wasting someone's money, which it gets to be pretty critical when you do this on the consulting side. So you can just go right through this one. So this is our approach to bias identification, or at least mine. So we'll see how these overlap with other Busara folks here. So usually it's really critical for us to begin with a lit review, which seems pretty obvious, but there's a whole thing coming after this. We do the literature review at the proposal stage typically, and we have analysts do it, and usually not people like me, both because of time, but also good reasons, which are on the next slide. Oh, sorry, this is a sign of some of the general heuristics and biases, in case there wasn't another speaker getting to them. I wanted to have a slide in my deck so you could see them. Anyway, there are a whole bunch of things that we know apply to lots and lots of problems, right? So we kind of keep going back to the same pieces of literature that, while they're evolving, have been really instrumental in creating this kind of world interest in behavioral science and allowing us to all be here today and interested in thinking we'll solve the world's problems with it, which I think we will. So the interesting thing about literature reviews is I think they're done very poorly oftentimes when you're attempting to use them to solve a real behavioral problem. I split this into two components of how I like to have literature reviews done. And this is the important part because this is how the behavioral science from the academic side becomes the applied solutions. I usually assign an analyst who's the newest person I can find. Typically, I want someone that's very fresh. In part, this is capacity building for them, of course, which is how I paint it. But also, they're not going to have my innate biases, right? They didn't go through all the reading that I did in my PhD program, which is really centered in like the 2005 to 2010 range of the literature, if you want to date me a little bit. I usually give them those literature reviews. They're like, oh, tell me what to read. I want to make sure that Nate is happy with the types of findings I come up with. But unsupervised learning is actually really critical. I want literature reviews to go off track. I want to find out, they're kind of putting these search terms into Google Scholar or wherever, and I want them to kind of find maybe slightly adjacent topics that, oh, I hadn't really thought about this particular connection, or I didn't know that someone else was working on this I mentioned agroforestry here as a fun example and a pet topic of mine. But I usually want them to kind of just like go off and range around. And then I return and I ask them, well, did you find these few like really important articles, right? Have you read anything about social proof? Or did you read about hyperbolic time discounting, something like that? And if they found those things, like, oh, I did, I'm such a great analyst, aren't you happy with me? And I tell them yes, and everything is nice. If they don't find those things, instead of telling them, oh, get back on track, this is what you should have found, I usually find the best insights are these kind of new, maybe slightly adjacent things that I wasn't really expecting. And of course, sometimes people just like go way, way, way off track, and guiding them back ends up becoming really necessary. And so I put this in a little bit at the bottom, but I'm notorious at Busara for just massively underspecifying things and leaving people to themselves. It's for learning, for everybody's learning. So the other side of things that I do, 'cause I actually do work too, I don't just assign work to people, is I try to understand, why is this behavior failing? Do any other problems have similar causes? And you end up finding relationships that you weren't expecting. So I highlight one of them, which is agroforestry, people planting trees on farms. It's good for the environment. This should just be a topic for everyone. And there are a lot of similarities in terms of people's cognitive processing of decisions to plant trees on their farms, smallholder farmers, with digital savings in terms of how they're thinking about time discounting and investments and returns. They're thinking about the security of this asset while it sits somewhere, which they may not be familiar with yet. And they also have kind of fears of it being a representation that allows people to identify a social obligation, right? If everyone knows you have savings in a savings account, they can come ask you for loans. If everyone knows you have trees that they could cut down and use for firewood or sell or take your mangoes, they might come and do that, right? So they're actually very similar. Hey, you get There's actually very similar cognitive components to these two problems, which you might not think about combining this way. So do these biases apply? And then search the split for validation that you didn't just get a little too creative with yourself. Okay, so the next thing we do is attempt to understand cognitive mechanisms. And we do this in a controlled environment in a lab. So Busara has a kind of large, formalized, standing lab in Nairobi that's very similar to what you'd see at many universities. But we're doing something different than the academics. We're running simulations. We're trying to identify semi-contextualized versions of whatever problems we're attempting to solve. And then trying to see if this bias that we found in the literature actually presents itself in a semi-contextualized modality. And so this is just a little picture of labs in case, like, what is this lab? So it's computers. We can control everything from temperatures and who people are kind of among, time of day, obviously, and lots of other things that can really impact people's subjective experience. So this is just some pictures of our Nairobi lab. And so what we do in the lab is making sure that these biases kind of exist and they have accurately been perceived to be related to the problem we were trying to solve. And so the next part of this, which is another very critical piece that falls through the cracks too often, I think, when people are doing intervention design, is the kind of co-design process where you're working with someone who is an implementing partner. They are a client in some cases if you're designing a product or a marketing campaign. But there's a good way to work with them in a bad way. And this is what I think is the good way. So the first thing is we're trying to, kind of ideate. We're coming up with the interventions that we want to test. We include the usual things, just get them out of the way, right? Like everyone can list the top 5 or 6 things that we expect to be applied here. And then we usually try to get really creative. And so on the small teams, it's nice to run just a really, really open brainstorm with no clients involved. People can't interrupt. And again, leveraging on novices in the room, it's good to start with the most junior people who might otherwise follow my lead for reasons that the psychologists know in the room, and to kind of get them to come up with their ideas and write them down. And if people want to interrupt and jump all over these things, this is mainly constructed as innate control, but you're intended to write things down, right? This isn't meant to be a discussion. People in turn can get their ideas out, and we can respond to them later, but no one's jumping all over each other in this intervention design process. And it's really critical to not have clients, sector experts, or kind of non-behavioral science people, or anyone really with a vested interest in the actual outcome in this, because it ends up being really constrained. You end up getting caught up with kind of their status quo or their fears of feasibility, right? Like, it's nice to brainstorm when you don't have to implement anything necessarily, because you can be very creative and completely think outside the box. And if you bring people in who are those implementers, they're less creative with you, typically. Obviously, bring the results of this brainstorm to your client and sector experts. And then it's really, really important, and this is another thing that Busara has actually gotten wrong on a couple of projects, but we've improved, is to listen to feasibility arguments from those clients, right? They may have very, very well justified reasons for not doing what you tell them to do. You could have thought of the best behavioral intervention, but there might be some kind of cultural overstep. It might not align with their brand. There are lots of reasons people might not want to do things. So when I first started at Busara, I had come from Chicago and kind of consulting world, and I'm a fairly aggressive American in a much more passive East African culture. And I thought we were attempting to get people to switch to a low-cost bank switch. So there was like this new banking product called Pestilink, which ended up not doing very well, not our fault. Bank compliance issues. But they were trying to get people to move to that for mobile money. It was actually cheaper than M-Pesa is in Kenya, which hopefully people have heard of by now. And in that example, I thought, it'd be really interesting if we just gave them this kind of strong loss aversion. If you don't lose Pestilink, you're wasting money you could spend on your children's food and education, which to me felt like a really powerful behavioral message, and like maybe this isn't going to align with us, right? No matter how strong it is, no matter what you show us in the lab, we simply can't put this in front of people because it'll be embarrassing and we'll have to double the staff of our call center to take complaints. And so there's some things you just can't do. But it's important to listen to those arguments, but not necessarily to heed them right away. to come out, ensure you have a full portfolio of interventions, and then to go back to some more testing. So, but if you don't listen until later, they'll get very angry. So this listening part here and noting down the feasibility criticisms are crucial, is crucial. Oop. There we go. So this is one example. You're designing an insurance product, and it's kind of like savings for education. So you'd save, and it was life insurance in the sense that if you died, your children's education would be paid for. And so we wanted to understand if different framings of this product in terms of what we call it affected the outcomes. And so we came up with these couple of ideas, and we brought them back to the lab to test. Oh yeah, so we can go to the next one. So what we do is we have these things, we have these couple of really great ideas, and the idea of bringing them to the contextualized lab, or we do lab in the field where we'll take kind of a lab, computers, and bring them out to contexts where the participants are more familiar with the environment, whether it's a school, church, mosque in their neighborhood, something that makes them feel like they're not so far outside of their typical decision-making domain where it's a bit inefficient though to sit in all of their houses, though. We have done that before as well. And go back to the horse race one. So what happens here is we actually are kind of horse racing these interventions, which is why I mentioned before, it's critical to have a bit of a portfolio. You want to have some safe interventions that you know will likely yield at least some small effects, and maybe your crazier stuff that the client told you is infeasible, but you still want to see if it will come out in the field. So this is a couple of examples. This is a mobile lab we set up in Fiji. This is a mobile lab that was on a bus in India, which some people in the room I would assume know about. And so it allows people to respond to these types of interventions in kind of more familiar environments and not having to travel and incur costs and do all sorts of things that might impact how they're thinking about whatever decision you're trying to study. So in this example, we were trying to get people to take up insurance. And people came to us and said, in Kenya, the big problem with insurance is that people don't trust the product. They don't think people will pay them. They don't trust the companies. There have been a lot of fraud in terms of the intermediaries. And we're like, okay, these all sound valid. And they wanted us to test different ways of improving trustworthiness of their brand, essentially, so we could get low-income people to buy their insurance. And so it turns out that we learned through this testing and bringing things to the field and testing all their hypotheses of trust against ours, was that people were actually most confused about how to make claims. That process and all of the kind of behavioral and cognitive barriers that people perceived as being part of making a claim was what resulted in them not taking up the product in the first place. And so by doing this sort of horse race, we were able to prove that point. And then the nice thing is you can live pilot if they trust you, which is why longer term engagements with clients can actually lead to much more interesting product innovations and more impactful outcomes, especially when you're working on poverty alleviation. But if they don't do it, and this has happened to us sometimes, we have to do it ourselves. And so we wanted to prove this whole claims-led insurance thing, but this very large telco said, there's no way we're going to completely reformulate insurance and try to sell it in the market. This is a massive undertaking for us. It could change how people perceive our brand. And so at Busara, we actually designed our own insurance product. So they were trying to sell insurance, right, for education. Remember that part? And what we wanted to do is replicate it, but we couldn't sell this like fully scoped insurance product. And so what we did is we designed one that allowed people to buy insurance against the rainfall. So it was in the rainy season, and if it rained, people could make a claim and then get the fees for a matatu ride, right? So the bus would take their kids to school so they didn't have to walk in the rain. So it was like kind of analogous, a little bit cute. And it wasn't believed, and so we were like, well, we're gonna try to sell this by going out and doing demonstrations of claims processes so people can kind of fully understand that process. And then we were going to see if they'll take up our products. And we actually sold this in the market in Nairobi, which was supposed to be a little uptake test. And it did so well that to get out of problems with the Kenya Revenue Authority, we had to then go back and give people their money back because we are not an insurance provider, and nor are we an underwriter, but we were for a couple of days. Anyway, this ended up being convincing enough that this company then decided to take up our product innovation. And for all of the behavioral reasons, we expect them to be much more successful at ensuring low-income people. I have like 10 seconds left. This was his last part. So if we don't know, sometimes we just don't know where to start, and we're not confident enough. So the client comes to us and we're like, oh, there could be these biases, but we're not really sure, or we think that there's an issue with trustworthiness in Nigeria, so how do we know how your brand will be perceived? And so we do something that's both fun for us and interesting, which is, you can go to the next one too, which is that we do these things called off the records. You can do one more. Yep. So you can't really see this well, but it's on our website. So off the records are when we kind of have ideas for how some cognitive bias might be applied or realized in a particular context. And we just run tiny studies. Typically, they're like underpowered. I'm not going to lie about that. They're also not very well funded. Those two things go hand in hand. But what we find in these is that we can get kind of an indication of directionality and enough intention that we can kind of pitch an intervention design that we might not have otherwise done, which is hard. Sometimes it's difficult to be brave with other people's money when your reputation is on the line. And this is a way of sort of bridging that gap. So we take these investments, we do interesting things, they turn into Medium posts and marketing materials for Busara, but they also allow us to have new interventions we might not have been able to convince a client to try with us. So this is just kind of a final slide on how we did a trust thing, so you can read this slide later. But what I've been attempting to help you understand here is that the behavioral science and knowing the academic literature is really, really, really critical, but every problem has its really own, it's a specific context, and if we don't properly contextualize that literature, things don't meet, and clients don't like it. And I keep saying clients, but this could be the Gates Foundation, this could be a telco, this could be a bank. And if we don't have buy-in from industry and partners, like, well, what's the point of behavioral science, really? And I can't have that because I've invested my whole life in this stuff, guys. So anyway, I hope I've kind of given you an idea of how this process can work in application once you leave your Warwick's program in behavioral and economic science. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. They're going to come back. So, I'm going to call Anurag and Sujoy back to the thing because we're going to start our panel. So, thank you, Nate. Thank you, Anurag, and thank you, Sujoy, for sort of sharing your insights. I think, Sujoy gave a very good overview of like basic behavioral biases and sort of concepts, and I think a lot of shared themes between the three talks. And I think, especially between what Nate and I think Anurag were talking about in terms of this, I guess this trade-off between doing, risky projects that may not necessarily always work out versus things that you really believe in and things that you really want to try. Okay, so we do have about 30 minutes to basically do a panel discussion. So the way it's going to work is that I have some leading questions, and we also have we can take questions from the audience as well. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll point to you, and that means you're lucky, and somebody will give you a mic. I think what I'm going to just start off also, if you want to speak, just turn on your mic and go for it whenever you need to. I think what we're going to start with is just a very basic thing that I think Anurag alluded to in his talk, which was about the education, the formal education of behavioral economics and behavioral science in India. So there have been a few sort of elective courses, a few kind of small efforts, both in Mumbai, Pune, Delhi. I think Sujoy's been doing that for a long time. And but I think what you were alluding to was sort of a more an entire course, maybe just for behavioral science, just for behavioral economics. So how do we get? This is not just to you; it's also to everyone else here. How valuable is that? And of course, how can we sort of get that started?
So can you hear me still? Okay. I was saying, before we did behavioral sciences, I did 10 years of marketing, right? And I never studied a book for marketing, right? I mean, we studied whatever we studied at BA, and then we expected experience to kind of do the job for us, right? So I don't think academics can be de-linked with behavioral sciences ever, right? No matter how many years you spend in this field, you're always reading articles, you're always kind of studying this science, right? So what we are really looking for is base level preparation, if at all. I mean, a lot of people in our system are from design backgrounds and all of those, and now you can't make a distinction between whether they came from behavioral sciences or they came from design, right? Because you have to study the science in the system all the time, right? What I really meant was that, there's so many kids going abroad, right? Some who can afford it, but there are a lot of people who can't afford it, right? I mean, there should be a direct channel to the kind of courses UCL and LSEs of the world are teaching in India, right? And I see interest, I mean, we get applications from Indians in India, of course, but even when we are recruiting in our New York office or in our Chicago office, we get so many applications from Indians. So obviously there is some kind of a momentum, right, that's caught on, and there are like lots of Indians going abroad and studying the science, right? So as much as I appreciate what you're already doing, I think there is a large space for, organized courses, right? And like MBAs do, right, they kind of have an academic component to the course, but they also have an industry participation in the course. There are internships you do, there are trainings you do. I mean, all of it has to come together, right? I'm not even happy with the fact that, there are one-year courses in UCLs and LSEs. I mean, there is so much more to learn in behavioral science than finance, marketing, and all of that, right? So if marketing can take 2 years to make you an MBA, which is basically a general manager, right? To kind of say that I can do policy work, that I can kind of influence sanitation, I can influence HIV, I can influence adherence, right? How is 1 year enough, right? So I think there's some kind of a shortcut being worked on academics right now, and somebody should go the long cut and say this is just too important a science. You can't shortchange it. Let's go run graduate courses, postgraduate courses, and properly train people. Or the industry like us and you kind of take up the task, which is what we are doing. I don't care who walks into my door, whether he's got behavioral sciences, behavioral economics background or not. We'll kind of make sure that, over 2, 3 years, we'll be patient to kind of get you fully accustomed to that science. So that's primarily what I meant.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Any more thoughts on that? Uh,
We're all in
yes.
agreement.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that never happens at panel discussions, I guess. So, but anyway, but what I will say, just to take off from there, is that the so the kind of the kind of exposure that I think students in, say, regular economics courses might have to behavioral sciences, again, probably very concentrated, very specific. You read a few papers, you do a few assignments maybe, and that's the course, and then you move on to the next semester or whatever it is. So I think definitely there's probably maybe think of something, even if you can't go the whole hog the first time, like do a full 2 years behavioral science course. If that's risky, then even at least like maybe a behavioral science specialization or something of that sort. So, yes. Okay, so if we don't have any questions on that, I will probably go to the next question.
I have
which
something
is,
to
sure,
say on
yes.
that. Actually, behavioral science, I know we're kind of using them interchangeably, behavioral economics, but behavioral science is much, much, much more than behavioral economics. And behavioral economics largely has us do relatively reduced form things, whereas behavioral science includes neuroscience, includes a whole lot of other medico. Might be the reason, Anurag, if you want to know why it hasn't caught on. And we can do a little econ program. I can start a little econ module in JNU if they'll allow me to. But I think to be a good behavioral scientist, it's team efforts usually. It's people working in hard sciences, working with, because a lot of the insights into economic and social behavior that you're drawing are actually from these hard sciences. It's just that, most of us, like people like me, I'm really good at math, but I still don't know really hard science, like biological science, like, these things would have to be learned. So it has to be bigger. I think it has to be interdisciplinary, and it can't be just a little course teaching you that. You have to draw from everywhere else. So ideal it would be in a university where students can take biology courses, can take courses on hard cognition, because that is necessary. Otherwise, I find myself being kind of lazy, and I've been doing this for the last 20 years, and I find that because I don't have a grasp in neuroeconomics, for example, even though I was a data point in the first study in neuroeconomics. That's besides the point. But so that's all I had to say. That I think we need, this is more challenging than, it's appearing on stage where we are all in agreement. But it's tough to build a behavioral science program.
I think if I can make a quick point, right? I think behavioral economics students, anybody who wants to study behavioral economics, do spend at least 20% of your time in cognitive sciences.
Yeah,
right?
read beyond your economics, this is the thing.
So there's somebody raised
Question in
their
the
hand.
back.
Point actually, and I've been wondering this throughout the presentation, is the forgetting of the fact that it's psychological and behavioral science. Well, we're talking about not just brain, we're talking about the mind as well, right? And when you're talking about hard sciences, are we forgetting the fact that behavior is contextualized? So sociology, anthropology, and more than that, social psychology are important disciplines to take care of when you're talking about, designing behavioral change interventions, when you're talking about behavioral science. And one of the things that I've discovered over a period of time, because I teach a course in behavioral science and writing at Ashoka University. I'm on a semester break right now, but that's essentially what I do. What I've discovered is that it doesn't really need the backing of economics at all. What it needs is the forgetting of the fact that there is a rational optimal model, but have to think about the fact that there is behavior in the context. And you want to study that, and there are a bunch of researchers who are all talking about the same thing from different perspectives, and we have certain frameworks that have been given to us, developed by behavioral economists or social scientists over a period of time, relying on those frameworks and then working with that. So I feel like in this case, yeah, well, we can totally lose the economics, include the economics, of course, but that's something that I feel that when we're talking about interdisciplinary, we should be thinking about it more broadly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at Busara, actually, people come to us, and it's Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. So they assume it's a whole bunch of behavioral economists, but we actually hire really, really broadly for these exact reasons. You need anthropologists, you need cognitive scientists, and you need people to kind of build all that context. What we do then is, especially if they're working on, they're coming in and working on maybe a more discrete behavioral economics problem, is that we give them kind of more traditional experiment training and those types of things in-house. And then those materials end up being useful for teaching executive ed courses, or in January, a group of students from MIT is coming out to learn how to contextualize experiments from an experimental program at MIT. So these things all end up kind of working together, but you do need a really large ecosystem of practitioners, I think.
Okay, thanks. So I want to jump into sort of another issue that we have as a talking point here, which is a lot of the results from behavioral economics, and again, I'm using behavioral science as well, but they're kind of heavily context dependent. So we heard about that from Final Mile's experience. We heard about that from sort of what Basara is doing. And, we know that generally from the literature that there is a lot of, in fact, one of the main critiques, I believe, of the RCTs was that, you're doing these very small kind of experiments, and then they're hugely context dependent. So how, I mean, this again across the board, but how do we make them, more scalable? I mean, is it even the fact that we can have this, overarching generalizable kind of theory of how humans behave, or anything of that sort? So, yeah.
This is a question I have to answer a lot. So, so to your point, right, when we're thinking about doing really large-scale RCTs, they're expensive and they terrify everybody. So as the person who's responsible for ensuring that Busara has revenue, I have to sell things that people would want to take up. And large-scale RCT is not the way to frame them. So what we have to do, the alternative to that, if you're not going to go for kind of a full causal model that's very rigorous, is to sacrifice a bit on what you're measuring, right? So if you want to measure education outcomes, those things, some intervention might have effects that take 5 or 10 years to measure. But it's not feasible to do that RCT. I can't tell them, give me $20 million, we'll change the world. They have maybe 200,000 at the most. And so finding these kind of intermediary measures, I think, ends up being really, really critical in ensuring that there's a high level of buy-in from, Gates, or they match some SDG or something like that, ends up being the only way to actually allow that science to happen, unfortunately. But there's just not enough money.
But I also feel that there's a big road, and Jean Drèze recently wrote a little op-ed, which I think he made a lot of sense. This RCT debate where one Genuite has got the Nobel, and we are all very happy, but people are very unhappy. So he polarizes the crowd beautifully, him and Esther, not least by their behavior, which is very candid, you know. And the thing is, though, is that there's a big, long road between evidence and program design. Like it's there, it's like there, and, you know, and evidence is here. So this evidence-based policy, I think Esther and Obijit actually are fantastic scholars, and I think they've made us understand many things in economics, which traditional trained people like me did not see before them in development. But I think their publicity teams and all sell it like, hey, here's evidence and here's the program. It can't be like that, because you have to really evaluate contextual effects. If you read their papers, actually, you know, these papers on RCTs, it is millions of robustness checks and, you know, all kinds of, by the end of it, like some of my students are like, sir, what are they saying exactly? That's because they're researchers, right? So you can't take their headline thing and make it a program. I think there's a tendency, just like there's less education about behavioral science, I think funders, donors, users of this also think that it can just be picked up some statistic and made into a program. No, it can't be. And the problems you talk about context with data, like, you know, this kind of sufficient but not necessary conditions, like I left the TV on and the house blew up, you know, which is correct causally, but it's not, because you're picking up one part of the process. You know? So these kinds of things are not, there are problems with all data sets, NSSO, NFHS, IHDS, you know, all of the stuff that I'm using, you know, and crunching and, you know, submitting papers, they all have the same problem. You take it out of the context, the woman will not express the same sun preference. It has to do with the enumeration environment, people going in there. So forget about the context effects. I think just be a little human, I think, in looking at this evidence and understanding what scales up and what doesn't scale up. And, you know, I mean, you'll be wrong a lot of the times because things may not work at the 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, 200,000 observations, but start to make a difference at 2 million. So I think there we have to all use our judgment, you know, people like, you know, all of us, you know, doing hard academic research, doing applied academic research, doing non-academic research, I think need to just get some common sense in. I think economics is not a discipline that promotes common sense. I think that's all I can say. I mean, seriously, you went to Carnegie Mellon, I went to Purdue. I mean, these are the hard schools where common sense is looked down upon. It can't be done in a parametrized model with like hard estimation techniques, you know, stuff like that.
Just one last point on that. So that's kind of scaling these things and getting policymakers and funders to feel the impetus to actually, you know, create these larger scale RCTs to collect proper data and not just have the kind of solution in a box. We bring the lab and put policymakers in it. So we'll set up a standing lab at a central bank and have them guess at the outcomes for themselves, and then we'll run the study on, you know, low-income people from their country and just demonstrate, well, you know, your ability to look through financial disclosures and understand what the best credit product is very, very different from these other people. And if we don't do these experiments and contextualize it, it's pointless. And your assumptions are basically the least valid of anyone in this country. So,
yeah,
anyway.
thanks. Okay. I'm sure we have questions. Yes. Yeah.
So I just one question I had is, I know this was thrown a lot, but I just want to hear from you guys again. Just one quickly is, do you think that then if you think everything is too context dependent, then you don't do any scalable thing? Or do you think that, okay, this is what we do, but just be cognizant of the things that are other than that and then try to build around this model as a core model? Or you just throw away everything and do what you think are responsible?
Can I
Whoever.
I'm
so-
sure everybody has something to say.
So, but let me just get another question, and if that's all right. Yes.
Hi. I want to ask specifically about this nexus between lab in the field and what actually, you know, in some sense, actual product. Because, hi, hello. Because maybe there are some cases where you might have some decisions that are made in the lab that for some reason people choose insurance because it's like cold or hot or whatever it is. And then that's not really, I know that lab in the field is a way to bridge that, but lab in the field is not necessarily representative either of like the one-shot decisions that people make about insurance, about education, about going anywhere, right? So how do you make sure, I mean, I guess from both the perspective of Busara and the perspective of Finite Mile, about using this to make broader inferences about likelihood of uptake of product, or the impact on product design.
Okay, I guess we have one more question, and then maybe we'll move to the.
Thank you for the talks. My question is actually a follow-up of what the other person on the other corner said about scale. Like, from various conversations, I understand that even though researchers look very different at the ground level and they are very contextual, when you start taking them to scale, when you start blanketing them upon layer and upon layer from a state perspective, national perspective, or a global perspective, all these researches look almost the same in terms of what we're trying to find or fight, or what is the solution. So how do you actually look at scale while also maintaining the contextual researches that have been diagnosed during the process itself?
Okay, thank you. So I think I'll come back to you like maybe after the, sorry. So I think the big question is about scale dependence and sort of like, do you just throw away everything? If it's not scalable, then what's the use of it? And I think the other question was about the lab in the field, so yeah.
So I want to answer the first question first, which is the most radical one asked, which is that should we just throw it away then? It's not going to work. It doesn't matter. You scale it up. It's not working because some other variable will come in. So my point is, and I've been hearing these things as an economics teacher, behavioral economics teacher from the same department as Abhijit, because this is one big thing thrown at them. It's like, do we need these interventions? They cost millions of dollars. A recent PLOS ONE article said an average RCT costs 51 lakhs, folks. That's more than I've been paid in research funds in my whole career. Hello. Okay, so these are hugely expensive. So a good question, should we throw these away? My point is that human behavior is really, really complex, okay? And it is really, really context dependent. So context dependency is not an artifact of the procedures that Nate does, or I do, or Anurag does, or, Bias does. We are all trying to uncover this. Human beings are deeply contextual. But I believe if you don't use evidence to set policy, and if you don't use randomization, then it's becoming a global exercise of convenience sampling. And I feel that even if there is no first best, like how to exactly nail human behavior, which is what we are never being able to do. You scale it, you put it in another context, something changes. I feel it's still better than non-randomized, non-evidence-based policy building, which is what came before this stuff became kind of a revolution with computing techniques. And you had the Norplant trials and the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Those were just like pharma company, get a drug, go to the most vulnerable population, give them injections and let them all die. At least with some representation, we're getting a situation where you're forced to use all populations. I think it's also a scientific temper that's kind of induced, even though I know it's not a first best. So that's all.
We ask these questions a lot, right? If you're trying to scale a social program for an entire, the government of Nigeria, right? We can't test even in every state, let alone every community or local government. And so usually when we come into these large scale kind of intervention problems, we will first do kind of a landscape and gap analysis of, people have done experiments, in some cases by accident. They may not have had great controls or been so rigorous, but people have tried programs. Some of them have worked, some of them have failed. And so we can come in and collect the evidence and kind of use that maybe as a bit of leverage, because we can't obviously collect samples everywhere. And that doing the gap analysis allows the policymakers to feel like they're investing in creating evidence in the places where it most matters. Whether the problem is the worst in that situation, or they have political reasons to improve it the most in some place. And so anyway, we usually come into it and try to create a really broad ecosystem, which is actually why these events are so important, because we need to know the final miles who are doing this stuff. We need to make the academic partnerships, because no organization or no program can actually create a solution by itself. I think for this reason, that will scale. Yeah.
So a couple of quick points, there's lots of questions being asked, but to me, behavioral sciences is not just science, it's also art, right? So let's not kind of, look at science so rigorously that unless the math adds up, I'm not going to do anything about it, right? As a practitioner, right, I'm as worried about effectiveness as I'm worried about implementability, right? So where do we take those leaps of faith and say, how do we create solutions, right, that get implemented, right? I haven't done any wrong in 12 years, right? I haven't done something that kind of depressed results. And I haven't come out and made people worse, right? There might be times when we did not make them as better off as we wanted to, but I don't think we have negative results in 12 years, right, where the people are better off, and because of something we did, they're worse off now, right? Or they're kind of, the product is selling less, or the service is less effective, right? And so, how do we kind of keep that balance between science and art? And then context to context. I mean, context is not just about the people context, right, where the solution is working. The context is also of the industry, right? You look at the HIV problem in Africa, right? I mean, I've worked in Africa on the HIV context, and you can say Zambia is different from Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe is different from South Africa, and so on and so forth, right? So what do? Right? I say stop making exact solutions, right? Create toolkits, right? Where these hundreds of thousands of people who are working in the field, who are very, very aware of the context, can use your toolkit to create their own solutions. Why get so smart that I know how to create the solution for everybody, right?
There is no one-size-fits solution
Exactly.
in economics.
We do edtech work in India, right? I mean, there's so many edtech companies, right? It's easy to say, come bring it on. I'll kind of solve every edtech problem, right? Instead, what we chose to do was to kind of create a blueprint and say, here's a blueprint of how behavioral sciences can be deployed in edtech to kind of improve adoption rates, completion rates, and so on and so forth. And then kind of create a very low-touch model for these variety of companies who cannot invest $200,000 in kind of, a business that does $5,000 a business for them, right? And so kind of create a model where they can take a leap of faith from your blueprint and affect their things, do their iterations, and learn from it, right? So that's
In the field. Yeah, I mean, lab in the field has problems. I mean, it does, even though LIST doesn't talk about them, right, when he writes about field experiments, but they are making people do stylized things. So you can tell within the stylized context that their behavior differed. But yeah, to go from that to their generalized behavior. So Bowles, Gintis, and Hendrick and all these guys, a big project. That's the Homo economicus in 15 small-scale societies. They actually tried that. So they went to all these tribes and they made them play the dictator, ultimatum, trust game, etc. Then they also tried to proxy from the field environment and see if these correlated, right? That's at the heart of your question. Do this behavior even correlate what you get in lab in the field? So they found actually does contextually correlated, but out of context, often they don't correlate. So there is a problem with lab in the field in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no kind of, you're either sacrificing on control, so you do things in the lab when you need to understand a really specific cognitive mechanism and have everything controlled for, but obviously then you lose context and it doesn't apply and might be too decontextualized to really give us an idea of whether or not someone will take up a product, right, if that's the ultimate thing that you're trying to solve. And so really we're kind of like on this sliding scale from the sort of rigorous structured lab environment to something that's an actual live test, like A/B test of a product. And what we choose to do on that continuum actually depends on the type of evidence that the policymaker or implementer needs to address their question in the moment. And so it's not, there's not really a perfect tool there. You're sacrificing something anywhere. And so you have to choose your sacrifices based on the evidence needs.
Stakeholders need to be honest, like researchers need to be honest with their limitations, and funders, donors, and all need to be reasonable with what they can expect. And I think things work out then. It's these, these denied expectations and two sides which causes problems.
Okay, well, I mean, I realize that we're kind of short on time, so there are more questions, so I just want to take the questions rather than kind of do these questions that I have. Let's go there first, and then the gentleman who's been waiting for some time, and then you.
Yeah. Hi.
Sorry, I meant her. She had her hand up. Sorry. Yes. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm apologizing for him. I actually just wanted to add something that came to my mind as you were speaking about context. How I view context, I view it as just a data point. It's just one of several data points that pops up that I can say, and I really liked what the gentleman to the right said about a toolkit. Context is that data point that says, certainly in how we use it, if this happens, then maybe you need to look at these other elements. So I use it in an if-then scenario, and context is simply one tiny data point in a toolkit of things that we use. So I just wanted to kind of
thank you.
throw that out there. And no, there was no question, so I'm going to give it back to him.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring the question of macroeconomics here. So are there any behavioral interventions you can look for when you're looking at macroeconomics? And if there is, there is a field which is coming up, behavioral macroeconomics, but is it possible to measure the effects with the tools of RCTs when the context is it's too large, right? So, and another thing which I wanted to ask was, so for example, if you you make an intervention in a certain state, say in Bihar, so the impact of that evaluation, does that also, somehow later on impact surrounding states like UP or Bengal? So is there any way, it can reduce the outcomes for the people in those states? Yeah.
Yep, thanks. The gentleman in the red shirt, I think that's right. So.
My question was more around, I think one is the question of scale. And the other is the question, one is the question of scale, and the other is the question of the stickiness of nudges, right? How long before people wise up? I think that's a question that I'd invite your comments.
Okay. We just have one last question here up in front, and then you guys all have 2 minutes.
So I think my question's actually, it's more for Sujoy, and anybody else on the panel should feel free to answer. I think just from your experience, whether from the theory as well as the practical, and this is related to the last question of nudges, is also what triggers changes in behavior? Like what are the key things you found to trigger changes in behavior, and when are such changes transitory versus persistent? So are there any sort of big lessons on that? So it's a bit connected with that. And I think just one quick disclaimer I wanted to give, like full disclosure, not disclaimer, disclosure is that both of us are from JPAL. So if there are any RCD questions, we are more than happy to take them. We are going to be talking about it, but Sujoy did a great job of criticizing RCTs and defending RCTs at the same time, and we are very happy to
like
also.
A true economist.
So we will be presenting stuff on the context, scale, and all of that. So this is.
So we have only 2 minutes, so I'm going to start interrupting people if you go on too long.
And the transients and all, because I have a paper actually in ecological economics, you can read it, just got published, where we give a nudge in an office in these IT firms. It's not an RCT by a long shot because we didn't have that much money. And we give this of these posters which talk about environmental conservation, and we have a control firm which is very similar. So I mean, we don't do an RCT, but it's very, very similar, these firms. And we actually give the nudge for a 1.5 month period, and then we see the effects on paper conservation. It's a completely naturalistic measurement experiment with no monitoring on computers, etc. Then we do one thing. So ecological economics said, okay, but how do you not know that your treatment group is not related to some other issue? It's too small, your treatment group. So it could be that the guys in your treatment group also got this messaging from home, your convenience sampled. And so you're seeing that boost because of what they got from home, not from your posters. How do you check that? So we had a very ingenious thing that we came up with. We ran the experiment for another year, this time on the same dates the next year without the nudge. And the nudge does disappear. So these things are transient, I can tell you that. And I can even tell you, we fit a log function, a log linear function, and I can even tell you the rate of decay. Yes. I can even tell you if it's significant at the 1% level. So yeah, they do decay.
Yeah, and you can read his papers. So.
Yeah, so I was hoping we'd agree on this, and we do. We know that almost all of these kind of nudges, even the really broad-based scaled things, end up being transient in some way. And so, again, that kind of like exposure to whatever the nudge, that stimulus, is really part of the contextual effect in the way that we look at it. And so, to that end, and because we want to have impact at Bosara, we've actually kind of reformulated our offering in the market to really be focused on kind of building and embedding behavioral science teams, coming in and doing one policy implementation and one RCT or two RCTs and making a recommendation and leaving, doesn't have the lasting effects. And we care about behavioral science's reputation for creating lasting effects. And so only by kind of building stakeholders, building capacity within organizations so they can do continued testing and ensure that they're responding to changes in context over time, I think it's kind of the only way to go. So I don't believe in persistence.
You
at all.
can't do the same nudge. People wise up, and you have to keep it updated.
Anurag. Yeah.
I'll only take 30 seconds. So, I mean, nudge, I think, is a small part of design overall. So can't think of every nudge. Every design is nudge, right? And the durability of design, right, is what you're asking, how durable a design is in influencing behavior change. I think few factors, right? How embedded a design is, right, in the environment, rather than how blatantly it speaks to you, right, is a critical factor, right? Somebody was asking me about yellow lines, and I was saying, the less people know that these lines are for them, the longer they will last, right? But then, I keep giving this example, right, saying, I want a door to be pushed all the time, right? So if you design a better language, a better handle, maybe it will have some durability and then it will decay, right? But if you don't put a handle on that door, for a door to be pushed, how long will it last, that nudge? Well, that's lifetime. I mean, you can't do anything to it apart from pushing it, right? So I'm saying when you're designing, right, and that's the art part of it. I mean, you can interpret behavioral sciences as, a social proof principle, a familiarity principle, and this and that. But ultimately, when you take an experiment into an experience, you're kind of creating a design that, depending on the capability of design, will last and will not last, right?
Yep.
So I don't think there's a straight, equation to it, in a way, so to say.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think we've run out of time. So I want to thank Anurag, Nate, and Sujoy for being part of this. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, guys. I think that was a really interesting session. We've got a tea break now for 15 minutes. If you go straight through the doors and to the left. And just a reminder to everyone to keep their phones on silent so we don't disturb the conversations. See you back in 15. And please be on time so we can start the next session on time. Thanks.